In this lecture, I want to talk about two linguistic concepts, that of the speech act, together with the speech event, and the linguistic notion of politeness. Let's look at some of the key concepts. I've mentioned the notion of a speech act. A speech act is anything we do with language. It could be complaining, it could be apologizing, it could be thanking, it could be requesting. Most of the time we do speech acts in an indirect way. Sometimes we do it directly, but most of the ways that we perform a speech act is indirectly. And sometimes we do it highly dependent on context, in which case we call it a pragmatic act, pragmatic speech act. We can locate speech acts in speech situations, the actual physical setting of the speech act. And we can look at the larger particular description of what's going on as a speech event. Having dinner, for example, could be described as a speech event. There are many different speech acts within having dinner. Ordering food, maybe complaining, small talk, conversation, etc. Asking for clarification. These all happen within the larger speech event, say, of having dinner. And within a speech event, there may be particular speech genres, particular types of ways of talking. The notion of politeness we're going to look at is not a folk notion of politeness, not the use of magic words like yes and thank you and please, but a larger notion of what we call linguistic politeness, which is dependent really on face work or threats to a person's face or the way they like to think of themselves to be esteemed and not to be imposed upon. And we're going to talk about a particular formula which in politeness theory accounts for a lot of language use. That is, the degree of imposition we place upon a person, the actual relationship between you and the person you're speaking to in terms of distance and power, and that gives us a politeness formula. And then later we're going to look at our several speech acts. We're going to look at a couple of movies, clips from movies, and some evidence from Chinese and Farsi or Persian. Okay, the person who introduced the idea of speech acts is a man called John Austin. He wrote a book called How to Do Things with Words. And this is what he said about speech acts. Speech acts are verbal actions happening in the world. Uttering a speech act, I do something with my words. I perform an activity that at least intentionally brings about a change in the existing state. So there really is no distinction between words and actions. We often talk about a person who, we distinguish between people, he's a person of words, not of action. Austin points out that every time we speak, we actually do something. We can't separate it from a particular action. A particular direct action that is quite easy to see in terms of speech acts is what Austin called performatives. And these are particular words you utter, and by uttering them, things change. You bring about a particular change in the world. So if I say I baptize you Ron Weasley, then now you're baptized, your name is Ron Weasley. I named this ship the Titanic, and now it's named. I hereby pronounce you husband and wife. You're fired. I apologize. Just by uttering these particular words, I bring about a particular change in the world. Compliments to the chef. Enjoy. Buon appetito. Cheers. Of course, as you can probably tell, with some of these particular speech acts, you have to have the power to be able to do them. So I can't say I baptize you Ron Weasley if I don't have the authority to be able to baptize people. And certainly if I'm not a dignitary, then I can't really name a ship. It depends on the particular ceremony. The interesting picture there of Chief Justice Roberts and President Obama at his first inauguration is an example of the power of particular words. If you remember, Chief Justice Roberts got the actual oath wrong, and so they had to actually redo it inside the Capitol. So by uttering these particular words, you definitely bring about a change of state in the world. For the most part, though, we don't function in terms of direct speech acts. We function in terms of what we call indirect speech acts. So, for example, this is a no smoking area, is a request not to smoke. But notice it's just a declarative sentence. And have a look at this tricky one here, which actually has a direct and an indirect speech act involved in it. Thank you for not smoking. Direct speech act, thank you. Indirect speech act, don't smoke. It's a particular request or order. I like the shirt you're wearing. Again, a declarative sentence, which is really a compliment. But no, notice how it achieves it indirectly. And this one here, could you pass the salt? This has become conventionalized, so sometimes it's hard to see this as not a direct speech act, but in fact it isn't. Could you pass the salt is asking somebody about their ability to do so, but it's been interpreted as a request. So you may be in the situation, you may have been in the situation when you were in grade school that you perhaps asked your teacher, can I go to the bathroom? To which a pedantic teacher might respond, you can go to the bathroom, but you may not. Meaning, yes, you have the ability, but I'm not giving you permission. Other ones, important document, which kind of means don't tear it up. And then one that always confused me, bridge freezes before road, which really means attention, caution, bridge freezes before road. Another kind of speech act is one that is really kind of particularized to a particular context. The teacher wasn't drunk today. Invites an inference, of course, that the teacher is usually drunk. Or this one here that appeared in the Village Bakery Cafe and Market, unsupervised children will be given candy, caffeine, and a kitten, which indirectly means please don't let your kids run around the place. And what about this one, F-U-T-K? You probably don't know what that means, but in fact it is an actual insult. And to understand that as an insult, we have to understand the context in which it appeared. So there you see Natalie Maines of the Dixie Chicks. She's wearing a t-shirt with F-U-T-K on it. As you see it like that, it probably means nothing to you. But if we look at the context in which she wore that particular shirt, you'll understand it as an insult. So it starts with a song by Toby Keith, which has the immortal line in it, because we'll put a boot in your arse. It's the American way. Well, Natalie Maines said, well, anyone can write that kind of music, complaining about Toby Keith's lyric writing. And in turn, Keith responded, I'll bury her. She's never written anything that's been a hit. So they're having a fight. It's going tit for tat. The next particular situation is the Dixie Chicks are playing a concert in London. This is 2003. It's the time of the Iraq invasion. And our Natalie Maines kind of puts a foot in her mouth when she says to the audience, just so you know, we're ashamed the President of the United States is from Texas. Of course, the Dixie Chicks are from Texas too. Well, that really annoyed Toby Keith, and being the good patriot that he is, he created this Photoshop picture of Natalie Maines being hugged by Saddam Hussein, and he used this as a backdrop to his concerts. And so that brings us full circle to this particular awards show concert in which Natalie Maines wore this t-shirt with F-U-T-K. You probably worked out now what the F-U stands for. If you haven't, let me tell you, it means fuck you, Toby Keith. Excuse the language. Of course, Natalie Maines' people said it had a different meaning, and if you look at the top there, what they said it meant was freedom, understanding, truth, and knowledge. Yeah. Okay, that's a pragmatic act. We can only understand it in context. The speech act is an insult. Okay, so we can look at the larger particular the larger context in which speech acts take place. We can call this a speech situation. It tends to refer to the physical setting. So think of a funeral, a wedding, a classroom, a meal, a bus stop. These are all speech situations. And within these speech situations, we have speech events. So for example, in a funeral, we can have a eulogy. In a classroom, we can have a lecture. At a bus stop, we have small talk. And at a particular wedding, also, we can have a toast. Um, I guess it's, yeah, the eulogy takes place at the funeral. I think I said wedding. And then a particular speech genre is a particular type of thing, like a mother-in-law jokes or lawyer jokes or blonde jokes or any kind of conventional way of speaking. We can have a look at the structure of a speech event. If you take a particular mealtime conversation, um, this is based on a particular paper which is in the optional readings called Father Knows Best, which is a study of dinner time conversations. And if you look at kind of dinner time conversations, and maybe this is a little old-fashioned, of course it's changed, but we can understand it as being ritualized in terms of participation, topic, and the way that the conversation is managed. So if we think of participation in a speech event, we can think about who has the right or authority to participate in a speech activity. So if you go to church, if you go to a mass, there are certain rules for who can participate at particular times. There are rules for who is entitled to speak and be listened to in a court, a law court. You're supposed to remain silent until asked to speak. And of course, there are certain restrictions on the kinds of topics we can talk about in particular speech events. The speech event of the bar is pretty fluid in terms of topic, but if it's a dinner time conversation with the family, and then it tends to be restricted to particular safer topics. And of course, then we also have the way that conversation is managed. How do you get an opportunity to speak? Sometimes that's formalized. Sometimes you have to jump in wherever you can, especially in a family conversation. So what we've looked at there is the notion of speech situations, speech events, and within those we have speech acts. So now I'm going to switch to the other linguistic notion here, that of politeness. And here are two examples of politeness. You couldn't let me have a bit of paper by any chance, could you? And give me a piece of paper, fathead. These are examples of linguistic politeness, not the politeness that perhaps you're thinking of through the use of the magic words please and thank you. So let's see if we can make a distinction here. Firstly, politeness expressions do not make you polite. So I wonder if you would be so kind as to piss off is still not being polite, of course. And similarly, in terms of a child who might speak to the mother like this, as much as I love your cooking, I must on this occasion most regrettably decline your kind offer of more spinach. Sassy child, likely to get a slap round the earo, I think. Those are examples of polite words, but they're not examples of politeness, nor are they examples of linguistic politeness. Notice also with politeness and orders, orders are not implicitly impolite. In particular contexts like the military, religious communities, etc., politeness is preempted. And probably in a situation like ordering food, certain politeness is preempted. There is a cost-benefit analysis with the use of imperatives. The degree to which an order is considered impolite is calculated according to the cost and benefit to the interlocutor. So if my wife says to me, brush the dandruff off your shoulders, I'm not going to say, hey, don't tell me what to do. I know that it's for my benefit. And similarly in the restaurant, if the waiter says, enjoy your meal, you're not going to say, hey, don't tell me what to do. But they are imperatives and could be interpreted as orders. Okay, so let's just go on a little further and talk more about this distinction then. Language encodes not only propositional content, but also an understanding of the relationship between the speaker and the addressee. So every time we speak, we mark the relationship between the speaker and the person they're speaking to. Linguistic politeness involves the choice of linguistic structures to imply the most appropriate speaker-addressee relationship. In every instance of communication could be considered to exhibit politeness. So if we go back to those two requests earlier, which I didn't get to say very much about. The first one was, you couldn't let me have a bit of paper, could you? Notice how that could be in a situation you're imposing upon somebody, and maybe that person is somebody you don't know. So you're saying a lot of stuff there. Notice you're using the negative, which is kind of pessimistic. Pessimistic. You couldn't let me have, and then a bit, which is trying to minimize the imposition. And then we have the tag, could you, which tends to soften the particular request. And so you might use that kind of language when you're imposing on somebody and it's somebody you don't really know. The other one there, which you probably thought, well, that doesn't sound very polite. Give me some paper, fathead. Well, imagine the context. Maybe you're talking to your sibling. Maybe it's your brother or your sister you're speaking to. So fathead then becomes a term of endearment. And you don't have to use any fancy language like could you. You can go straight to the imperative. Give me some paper, fathead. Okay? So it depends on the particular relationship you have, and that determines the choice of language. And that is the notion of linguistic politeness. We talk about face and face work. So when we choose language, we're thinking of how it's directed to a person's face. And everyone has particular wants or face needs. We like to be approved of. We like to be praised. We like to be esteemed. And also, we like not to be imposed upon. We don't really want to be asked to do things that we don't want to do. And that's what we call the notion of face. So every time that you impose on somebody, you're making a face-threatening act. Okay? So acting cooperatively, people try to build up their interlocutor's positive face, self-esteem, and at the same time they try to avoid posing threats to their negative face, and that's through imposition. So if we look at things like positive face, these are things that make you feel good. So this way, sir. So sir is an honorific which tends to show respect, right? So it's aimed at the positive face. But at the same time, an address term like dude could also be considered a positive politeness because you're considered to be, hey, I'm one of the in crowd. I'm a dude. That's or man, or whatever the address term is. So similarly, hey, dude, nice haircut. Notice this compliments, of course, are always directed to positive face, your sense of self-esteem. At the same time, negative face refers to the desire to determine one's own course of action and not be imposed upon. So that's how we get to something like, you couldn't let me have a bit of paper, could you? Which is directed at negative face, and it's using a lot of language to show that you are imposing on that person. Taking into consideration all those particular issues, we can work out a particular formula for choosing language based upon imposition, distance, and power. So let's look at imposition. You could say to your friend, have you got a quarter? Okay, which is pretty direct. Um, and notice it's a quarter, so you're not actually asking for a lot. But your same friend, if you were asking for $20, you wouldn't probably say, "Have you got $20?" You probably say something like, "I left my wallet at home. Do you think you could lend me $20 for lunch and I'll pay you back tomorrow?" So depending on the rate of imposition, we choose language to reflect that we know it is an imposition. The other kind of dimension here is social distance. If we're talking to people that we know and talking to people we don't know, we're going to use different language. This is what we call social distance. So, for example, if you're asking, maybe it's commencement, and you're asking a professor at commencement directions. Excuse me, could you tell me where the convocation center is, please? Okay, so you're using particular language to mark the fact that you're talking to someone who is a stranger. There is social distance. And finally, there's the notion of power. Is there a relationship of power? So if you think of a situation of a soldier and an officer, the power differential has to be respected, to such an extent that you have to say, if you're the soldier, "Permission to speak, sir." Again, the choice of language is reflecting the particular relationship. Okay, so if you said, "Permission to speak, sir," to your father, that's not polite, is it? Because it's marking the relationship as being an authoritarian one, which, maybe you're intending to be sarcastic because your father is being overly telling you what to do. Okay, so given those particular dimensions, we get to a politeness equation. So social distance plus power differential plus rate of imposition equals the degree of face-threatening act to be redressed by appropriate linguistic formula. Okay, so you choose your language based upon these dimensions, and according to how they're likely to affect somebody's face in terms of imposition, social distance, and power. Okay, so let's see if we can have a look at some examples, and we can begin to look at the notion of speech acts and speech events and the notion of politeness. So you can get to this video on YouTube. It's down there on Blackboard, so you can pause the lecture and then watch this, and then come back to the lecture. So this is an example, and what I wanted you to listen to there was some of the kinds of ways that the woman complains and how she goes about complaining, because very much this is a speech act of complaining. But she doesn't say, "I complain," which would be direct. She uses a lot of indirect ways of indicating that she's unhappy with the particular meal. She starts up by saying, "Monsieur, is this what I ordered?" Okay, which is just a question. It's not a statement of complaint, where you would expect a declarative. And then further on, she says, "Excuse me, didn't you say this was going to be rice and seafood?" Which again was not a declarative sentence that we would expect with a complaint, but it's a negative question, so showing tentativeness. And then later she says, I just don't see anything that looks like a shrimp or a scallop." Notice the use of just there. Just is, again, part of linguistic politeness, in the sense it's showing tentativeness, it's hedging. You're not quite certain. Well, maybe you are certain, but you don't want to suggest to the other person that you're being certain and then imposing upon them. And then other ones, it's just not what I expected. Again, it's an indirect complaint, and this is how we operate most of the time when we use speech acts. We use indirect ones. And we're working within the notion of linguistic politeness. When you complain, you're making a face-threatening act against the other person. So you have to be very careful. So the choice of language is reflecting that particular relationship, that particular threat to the other person's face. Notice how the maitre d' uh, um, refuses to bring the spaghetti and bolognese in a very, very kind of indirect way, using lots of well. Well is an interesting word because it tends to indicate that the upcoming statement is going to be negative, or that is, it's going to be a refusal. Okay, the next example is one of ordering food taken from a movie called Five Easy Pieces. So again, you can pause here and you can watch that clip, and then we'll talk about the kinds of ways that that conversation illustrates the notion of speech acts and the notion of linguistic politeness. Okay, so now I've got the script of that particular conversation. It's a particular speech event, the ordering of food in a restaurant, which within it will have various, within the speech situation of a restaurant. Here, the speech situation is a diner, and it will have particular speech acts like asking about particular foods, making a request, etc. So let's have a look at the particular language. So Bobby, Jack Nicholson, says, I'll have an omelette, no potatoes. Give me tomatoes instead and wheat toast instead of rolls. Notice that we're in a restaurant, and the relationship between the customer and the waitress can be marked here. We don't need a please. We don't need a could I have to function on the level of linguistic politeness in a restaurant. So we can say I'll have, and the bare infinitive give me tomatoes instead, and wheat toast instead of rolls. What does the waitress say? She says no substitutions. Um, Notice that this is a face-threatening act because it's a refusal. It's a refusal to accept the order as being valid. Notice how it's being issued very directly. There's no kind of apology involved. It's just a very direct refusal. Here we would say that this was not linguistically that particular polite because it's no recognition that this is a face-threatening act. Bobby continues. What does that mean? You don't have any tomatoes? And the particular conversation now becomes, of course, anything but polite in any particular perspective, folk, or in terms of linguistics. It's not normally that you would use a phrase, what does that mean? No, we have tomatoes, but I can't have any. Is that what you mean? Only what's on the menu. A number 2 plain omelette. It comes with cottage, fries, and rolls. I know what it comes with, but that's not what I want. I'll come back when you've made up your mind. Wait, I've made up my mind. I want a plain omelette. And linguistically, in terms of politeness, it's okay to say I want in a restaurant situation. It wouldn't be, and of course, if the social relationship was different. Forget the tomatoes, don't put potatoes on the plate, and give me a side of wheat toast and a cup of coffee. I'm sorry, we don't have orders of toast. So here the waitress, and she's using I'm sorry, but you can tell by her demeanor she's not particularly sorry, and by her intonation. But at least now she's recognizing the face-threatening act of refusing the particular request. I'm sorry, we don't have side orders of toast. In the certain kind of redress, I can give you an English muffin or a coffee roll. What do you mean you don't have side orders of toast? You make sandwiches, don't you? Um, would you like to talk to the manager? Um, you have bread, don't you? And a toaster of some kind. I don't make the rules. Okay. And Bobby goes on, and clearly he's trying to make a point, and so there's no really relationship we can talk about that needs to be maintained between the waiter and the waitress and Bobby. Um, and so what we do have is a classic example, not of politeness, linguistic politeness, but of impoliteness, both linguistically and in terms of a folk notion of impoliteness. Okay, those are examples for movies, and now I'm going to just have a quick look at some examples, real examples from two different cultures. First one is from Chinese, and it's the notion of food playing. And this is food playing is the way they offer food, and this is a very ritualized way of offering food. And when you read this particular script, you might start thinking of it might remind you of particular routines from your own culture. And I think very much the notion of offering and refusing, offering, refusing, offering, refusing, and then accepting is something which is pretty standard in many, many different cultures. Um, so let's just read it together. So there's two examples here of food playing. One is in a restaurant. So H has invited G out for a meal at a restaurant, right? Um, so H says, Lo Wang, eat some more. And then G says, don't stand on ceremony, I've had enough. Yeah, that's not a particularly good translation. Um, uh, it probably would mean something like, well, you don't have to be like polite, I've had enough. So there's the offer and the refusal. And what we're going to get is three more offers and a final acceptance. Um, and notice the particular strategy here. The food is not good, but you have to have enough. Um, the food is delicious, but I can't eat anymore. Notice the contradiction. The food is delicious, which is direct to positive politeness, positive face. But I can't eat anymore. But you have had so little. No, no, I've had a lot. No, you have to eat more. Otherwise, I'll be offended. Okay, which is a particular strategy um, uh, to get the other person to agree. Okay, so once it gets to that particular level, then G has to say, "Okay, I'll have a bit more." So this is a very ritualized way in which food is offered and ritually refused until finally it's accepted. Here's another example, and this takes place in somebody's house. H says, Liwa, eat some more. G says, I've had enough. H, the, the host, says, come on, have some more. No, I'm stuffed. I don't believe you've eaten so little. I've eaten so much, I really can't eat any more. Is it because the food is not good? You know I'm not a good cook, okay? No, 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 no. The food is delicious, but I can't really eat more. No, you must eat more, or I'll be upset, okay? So again, the threat of being offending, of being upset. And then finally, the guest says, okay, I'll have a bit more. And that's a very common practice at between diners in having a meal in China together, where the guest has to go through this ritual set of refusals of requests for food from the host. Um, Finally, a particular example of again a phrase that's or a notion, a concept that's used in Persian or Farsi called shamandegi. And this is the notion of being ashamed. It's part of many speech acts in Persian. And these don't necessarily include offerings of food, of course, but expressing gratitude, offering goods and services, requesting goods, serving services, apology, refusal, and accepting offers. So Persian speakers use the expression shamandam, meaning I am ashamed when inviting guests to the dinner table. And of course, you probably feeling, well, that resonates with kinds of things that I know. I know my wife, when she has a dinner party, she always apologizes for the food to begin with. It was overcooked, or it's burnt, or something's missing from it. And then, of course, people taste the food and say, wow, no, it's delicious. So it suggests that their food is not worthy of the guests. Okay, so this is again another linguistic strategy to achieve positive politeness for the speakers from the guests, because they're all going to say, "Oh no, no, it's really wonderful." So it suggests the high degree of esteem that a host should hold for a guest, that they should say that their food is not worthy, and then they counter with praise for the particular food.